My name is Richard Nostrand. I live in Norman, Oklahoma, where I'm retired from teaching at the University of Oklahoma. I taught historical geography at OU for 31 years. And the title of my presentation today is El Cerrito, New Mexico. I've been told I need to do a better job rolling my R's. And I'm recording this for the Historical Society of New Mexico, and today's date is March 12th, 2021. Good. The presentation is divided into 4 parts, as you can see on this image. What got me involved in El Cerrito? 1. Number 2, a walk through El Cerrito's history, rebuilding El Cerrito's schoolhouse, and finally, why is El Cerrito important? So let's start with first part, what got me involved in El Cerrito. I was hired at OU in 1973. And here are John and Suzanne, my 2 kids, on the OU campus that fall of 1973. And for me, coming to OU was a very good deal. I wanted to work with graduate students, especially at the doctoral level. And I was coming from my first job at the University of Massachusetts in Amherst, where we had just had our master's program denied. And I also wanted proximity to the large Spanish American subculture centered on New Mexico. And of course, Oklahoma is only 1 state away. And 3 years after I came to OU, 1976, the National Archives released the census returns, the original returns for 1900. You had to go to one of the regional National Archives branches to look at these. So I spent much of the next 3 years at the Fort Worth branch and then at the Seattle National Archives branch, where I grew up in Seattle. And I went through in those 3 years more than 1 million names, beginning in New Mexico and working out from New Mexico, and making map after map after map. And my main finding is shown on this map. This is the Spanish American region in 1900, and you can see that the region is divided into 2 colors. The blue stands for Spanish Americans. I'm going to get my pointer down here on the blue. Spanish Americans that represent between 10 and 90% of the population. And the red is Spanish Americans that are more than 90% Spanish American. And believe it or not, there were 29 precincts shown by those black dots that had Spanish Americans 100% of the population. And one of those precincts, El Cerrito, was it was one of those 29 precincts. Now, you know, that red area is absolutely amazing. It is the size of the state of Tennessee. It represents half the region as a whole. And to have an area that large with the percentage of a group of people that high is totally amazing. So really what I found in my research in the census materials was that, in one sentence, nowhere in America has so large an area, the red area there, the size of Tennessee, been so purely ethnic, Spanish Americans, so recently, 1900. the region today looks much as it did in 1900. And what I mean by that is that the outer boundary of the region, basically the blue line, which is the 10% Spanish American line, the region today is really very close to what the region looked like in 1900. It hasn't changed. What has changed is that the influx of Anglos has reduced the Spanish American percentages decisively. The next map here shows the 5 study area villages that I then spent quite a bit of time in. And they include El Cerrito. Let me get my pointer. El Cerrito there. Now, El Cerrito is about 60 miles from Santa Fe, to the southeast of Santa Fe. So that was one village that I came and studied in detail. A second one is Manzano. A third one, San Luis. And next to each other up here, Chamizal and Peñasco in Taos County. And on a continuum down here at the bottom, you can see that these villages represent points along from completely abandoned up to actual population growth. So what I did after making all these maps was to take a list of 50 villages that I had very good data for, 50 out of maybe a total of 350 villages, and go out and look at those 50 villages and choose these 5 to study in greater detail. And I was very hopeful that El Cerrito would be amongst the 5 because as a graduate student, I had read this study. This is by Owen Leonard and Charles Loomis. These are 2 USDA rural sociologists. And they were hired by the USDA to study a village. And it was the first study in the rural life, the real community series. They lived in El Cerrito off and on in 1939 and 1940. And their study shown here is a classic. And I read this as a graduate student at UCLA. And I thought to myself as I read it, boy, if I could just see that village someday. I mean, I was taken by their study. So I was hopeful that El Cerrito would work out as a village that I would go back to. And there was a follow-up study by Irving Roussinaw. He was a government photographer employed by the USDA, and he created a photographic essay. So lots of excellent photos for El Cerrito. So what I had was good data from 1900 for the village, good data, really very good data for 1940, and I wanted to go out to the village and be there in 1980 and study it myself. Well, let me say that my first attempt to find El Cerrito didn't go so well. Now, this map shows the Pecos Valley. So here's the Pecos River going like that. And I was starting up here at I-25, and I was going down Route 3 along the Pecos, a beautiful drive. And I got to Villanueva, and I had an old map. Now, this is the trademark of an historical geographer. And the map showed that there was a road down the river valley from, I'm losing my pointer there, down the valley from La Cuesta or Villanueva to El Cerrito. And so I started down that road, and I got about a half a mile into my journey. And there was an end of the road. It stopped at the Villanueva State Park. And a nice guy said, hey, you know, there's a road on the other side of the river. And so I boldly forded the river in my Volkswagen Beetle. Now, this was October 1979. The river was very low, so there wasn't a whole lot of water in it. But I drove across the river, started going down the road on the other side, and it too ended at a high soil conservation corps fence. So I retraced my steps to the village of Villanueva. I don't see my pointer, but there it is. And I asked, well, how do I get to El Cerrito? And somebody said, well, that road down the valley was washed out years ago. What you're going to have to do is go over the Mesa Road. So I go over the Mesa Road, and I find that that is 6 miles of rough dirt road, which definitely had the effect of isolating this village of El Cerrito. And as I drove into the village that October afternoon, 1979, this is the very first photograph that I took of the village. You can see that the village is built on a terrace, and that terrace is up above the floodplain. And that site on the terrace is very constricted. So El Cerrito is a very compact village, unlike most Spanish American villages, which tend to be stretched out along an irrigation ditch. And because it's compact, I think it makes El Cerrito all the prettier. And after I took this photo, I drove into the village, and I was right in front of the Catholic Church on the middle of 3 streets. And all of a sudden, Heidi Landstra, shown here, appeared in front of my Volkswagen with her arms stretched high for me to clearly to stop. So I was going all of 2 miles an hour, and I stopped my car and I got out, and she said, "What do you want?" And I said, "Well, I'm a university professor, and I was hoping to come back to this village in the spring and maybe make a study of it." She said, "Well, you're going to have to talk to my husband." So she took me to Jack. There's Jack. And what started out as a rather confrontational encounter actually ended up being a very cordial visit. They had both gone to Highlands University in Las Vegas, New Mexico. They understood what people like me were all about. And they said, as I was leaving, look, you just tell us when you're going to come back in the spring, and we'll tell all our village friends that you're our friend and that we would like for them to talk with you. Well, it happens that this is the only Anglo couple living in El Cerrito at that time, and all their neighbors were Spanish, so they were paving the way for me. And as I drove out of the village that night and looked up at those bright stars, I said thank you to those bright stars. Now, let me tell you how fortunate I was. I was on a panel at a meeting in Albuquerque some years later. I was talking about El Cerrito, and when I finished, the next guy that stood up was Adrian Bustamante, who taught history at Santa Fe Community College. And Adrian said, well, let me tell you what happened to me when I went to El Cerrito. He said, I loaded a bunch of my students in a van, and I said, we're going to take a field trip, go down and look at this village of El Cerrito. And we drove in and we parked in front of the church and we started to get out. And a Spanish guy came walking up, packing a pistol. And he said, what do you want? And I said, well, I was hoping we could just take a look at this village. He says, like hell you will. And we all loaded up in the van, and that was it. We never did see the village. And that could have happened to me. All right, let me move on then to the second part, which is a walk through El Cerrito's history. And what I'd like to do is talk about a dozen benchmarks in the history of the village. So benchmark number 1, pointing there to 1824, is that the village is founded in 1824. Now, as I got into the research on the village, I found in the San Miguel del Vado land grant papers a list of the original 15 heads of household that settled the village. There were nine other villages on the San Miguel del Vado grant. None of them had such a list of the original colonists. Well, I was very lucky to get this list because with it, I could go to the archives of the Archdiocese of Santa Fe, and I could look, and it's simply a matter of looking. You had to memorize these names. There's no, no index of these names. I could look for these names in the baptismal, the marriage, and the burial records. And if I found them, I could then learn who they were related to, and I could put together a story of how these 15 people were related to others that explained the waves of villagers that would come in to settle in the village. So I could tell a story about how all this happened. I found all but 2 of the 15 names. I never did find Borrego there, and I never did find Hurtado down there at the bottom. But with those 13 names, I was able to piece together the story of the colonization of the village. And let me say that the person up there at the head of the list, Ramon Alari, he was the mover and the shaker behind the founding of the village. And what Alari did, he was a retired soldier from the Presidio in Santa Fe. He was dismissed actually for reasons of chronic illness. What he did was to petition in 1824 for 4 ancones of land. Okay, now an ancon is a bend. Let me get my pointer. There it is. An ancon is the bend in the river. That's what ancon means. So he was petitioning for that flat land within the bend of the river. It was floodplain. That one, that one, that one, and that one down there, 4 ancones. And he wanted those, of course, for irrigated agriculture. So he was awarded those 4 ancones, and he and these 14 other heads of households then go, and what they do is to establish the village. There's the pointer on the village site. And that village, which is up on a terrace that we saw, that village was named after that little hill right there in the middle of the valley. Technically, that's a meander core. And that is the El Cerrito that then the village is named for. And what they did on that site, that village site, was to build a compact placita. You're looking at my diagram, my attempt to draw what that placita looked like. There were 3 zaguanes, 3 great big heavy doors, I think, that led into the compound. And inside the middle of the compound was the church. And the church was literally a fort, no windows. And they would, if there were a threat of Apache Indians or other Indians, they would go to their church. There were no windows on those outer walls of the compound. So they founded their village beginning in 1824. Okay, now we're fast forwarding to 1841. In 1841, under the Mexican regime, a census was taken, and the census showed that for Cerrito, which is right there, there were 321 people. That's the largest population El Cerrito ever had. 1841, 321 people. And in that very year, half the people left. That little placita was just really too crowded. And where they went, that half of the people, get my pointer here, was to San Agustin, about 15 miles away. And I speculate here on the routes that they may have taken to get to San Agustin. San Agustin was being made available, free land in San Agustin, down the Gallinas River, downstream from Las Vegas. And this is what it looked like. We were down below the Canadian escarpment on that flat land. And the village church looks like this today. And how do I know that half the villagers left 1841 and went to San Agustin? They were there in the 1850 census. I mean, that half of the people in Cerrito had now appeared on the census for 1850. So that was second benchmark. Third benchmark in the history of the village is that the villagers built a school, a one-room schoolhouse. And having done that, San Miguel County would provide the village with a school teacher. So here's what the school looked like in 1841 when Roussinac took this photo. Now notice that the schoolhouse has two front doors. There's one and there's one. I'm sure that that was the original front door. It is centrally located and it's right under that dormer. This one, I would guess, had to have been added when the school, the number of kids in school, the school population increased to the point where they now could have two teachers supplied by San Miguel County. Here is a photo of the inside of the schoolhouse taken by Roussinac, 1841. The school teacher that year was a woman, Maria. What was Maria last name? I forget. And believe it or not, that little girl right there, whose name was Flora Armijo, I interviewed in Pueblo, Colorado, many years later. Okay, next benchmark in the history of the village, 1900. The population of, not the population, the prosperity is the word I'm looking for, reached its peak in 1900. This was when El Cerrito was in its heyday. And their wealth was based on raising sheep and then selling the wool in Las Vegas. So here we see sheep, and this next image shows wool wagons pulled up to Ilfeld's warehouse in Las Vegas, wool wagons. And this was taken in 1904, this photo. And the villagers would have done the very same thing, take wool in wool wagons into Las Vegas, to one of the warehouses. In 1900, the villagers had access to the Mesa common lands on the San Miguel del Vado grant, and that's where they could raise their sheep. Let me also say that they had agriculture. Here's a photo of a person from the village plowing land taken by Roussinac. And that land, was irrigated, floodplain, and it had to be irrigated because the villagers were living in a semi-arid climate. They had maybe 13, 14 inches of precipitation on an average annual basis. They didn't really sell much from their farmland by way of income for the village, a little bit of corn, some wheat, but basically their income was from wool. Okay, next benchmark. This is a photo of Margarita Quintana, the shorter of the two women. I don't know who that other woman is. Margarita Quintana was the first villager to be hired by El Cerrito to teach school. She was from the village and she was hired to teach there. And in interview after interview that I had with people from the village, they uniformly said Margarita was everything to that village. She substituted for the priest when the priest didn't come, and in fact, the priest came only once a month. She taught catechism. She uh, carved gravestones. She kept records of the births and the deaths in the village. She did a lot for that village. She was a very smart person. She went to Las Vegas to high school. So she went beyond the uh, eighth grade at El Cerrito, and she learned English, and she was a very powerful figure in the village. And here I have a photo showing the school children, believe it or not, 1917. And that year they had two teachers, and Margarita Quintana, right here, was one of them, and a second one is over there. Now, the person that I got this photo from was Geraldine de Blase in Albuquerque, and this photo belonged to her mother. And her mother um, drew a ballpoint pen circle around her face. And that's all right. It was her photo to draw her face, uh, outline it. But she apparently had some enemies, and one of them apparently was Margarita Quintana because she kind of, you know, scratched out her face. And there was another little girl over here that she apparently didn't like, and some kid down here on the front row that she didn't like. This is a remarkable photo. It's not taken in front of the schoolhouse. It was taken in front of a warehouse because the schoolhouse that year had been closed as a school. And I think that that was the year they were putting a pitched roof on the schoolhouse. And that was the first building in El Cerrito to get a pitched roof. So I would take this photo to the interviews with the villagers that I saw in Pueblo, Colorado, and Albuquerque, and I would say, "Can you identify the kids in this photo?" And I got maybe, I don't know, close to half of the kids' names now onto their um, faces in this photo. A remarkable photo. All right, now it's 1939, and Leonard and Loomis are living in the village, and here is a photo of Charles Loomis. I got to know Charles Loomis. Um, I met him at several meetings, and my wife and I went out to lunch with Charlie and his wife. He was a heck of a guy. He taught sociology at Michigan State University. He was president of the American Sociological Association. I mean, he had quite a reputation. I just wish that I'd asked him if I could take his photo because it would have probably been better than the one that I have of him. But Charles Loomis lived in the village in 39 and 40 with Leonard, not together and not the whole time. They came and went, and they rented the room at the back of this house, that room right there. And this house belonged to uh, Cleofas Ribera, so she rented them that room. And Cleofas Ribera lived next to the only two-story adobe in the village. And that two-story adobe belonged to the richest villager, a guy named Epitacio Quintana. And it was his warehouse that the kids were being filmed, photographed in front of in 1917. All right, next benchmark. Now it's the early 1940s and into the 1950s. And what happens is that the people in Cerrito begin to leave. This photo was taken by Rusina Easter Sunday, 1941. The men who sat at the back of the church had come out and had congregated here to talk, as they did by tradition after Sunday church. And the women who sat in the front of the church were coming out now to go back and cook the Sunday meal. And what were the men talking about in 1941? They were talking about jobs. Where are the jobs? And what had happened was that they had lost their mesa grazing lands. The adjudication of the San Miguel del Vado grant made that common land into homesteads. People could homestead that land. So they no longer had the economic base to raise their sheep. And they were really becoming quite desperately poor. So that's what they were talking about. Now, Roussinaud did not capture a family moving out of the village, but this photo was taken of the Martinez family as it was leaving the village of Cordova, and they were going to an urban area. And the place that the villagers from Cerrito went to was Pueblo, Colorado. About 4/5 of them went to Pueblo. And one of the reasons for it was CF&I, the Colorado Fuel and Iron, which was one of the sources of jobs for them. Okay, next benchmark in the history of the village. The schoolhouse is closed in 1951. Only 9 students remained as students in the school in 1951. And so San Miguel County said, nope, we're not going to pay for a teacher any longer. The kids are going to be bused. Now, I was able to find the school teacher that last year, and there he is in a black hat, Ramon Esquivel, and I invited him to join one of my field trip groups. This was in 1988, and talk about the school. He was the last teacher in 1950-51, and it was wonderful to have him on board. And here we are standing next to the Pecos. The Pecos is unusually blue, and it's quite low, and it's October of 1988. And what Ramon Esquivel told us was very interesting. What he said was, I knew the exact reading level of every one of those 9 kids, and we spent every morning, all morning, reading. That was basic. And we did everything else in the afternoon. And when school was over, I told the kids to clean up the schoolhouse because I had a stipend to pay for a janitor. And uh, I said, look, I will divide this money up amongst the families whose children are here in school, and we will just have the kids do the janitorial work. So they did. And I gave the families the money to pay for a janitor. And then he said, I got on my horse and I rode up the Pecos Valley, 3.5 miles to Villanueva, had to ford the Pecos 7 times, and I would pick up the villagers' mail. And I just loved doing it. So we were fortunate to have Esquivel with us for the day for that field trip. Next benchmark, 1967. By 1967, because of this village depopulation, there were 5 villagers left. Albenita Quintana was one of the 5. This is my photo of her in 1980. She spoke only Spanish, and she had invited a nephew, Joe Quintana, from Pueblo, Colorado, to come live with her. And this is a very nice thing that the Spanish society does. When there's an old person living alone and they need help, a younger person will go and help them. And in fact, Joe Quintana lives in El Cerrito to this day. Okay, next benchmark, 1980. Now this is a benchmark for me rather than for the village of El Cerrito. I lived in the village for 2 months in the spring of 1980. And Josie de Vaca let me use his house. So here I am all set up in his house. There's a stove over here with my coffee pot. That's a wood burning stove. And so that was my source of heat. You can see all my notes and stuff over here on the table. I practically froze to death that spring. I'll tell you what, Joe had quite a hole in his roof. And all that heat from my wood burning stove went out that hole. And outside, this is what it looked like. I mean, not always, but this was what it looked like when, at some of the time during that 2 months. You know, 5,700 feet. El Cerrito is kind of cold. Now here's what it looked like on a nicer day. Here's Joe's house. My pointer's pointing at it. And here's my red Volkswagen Beetle parked in front of Joe's house. And I was staying in that in room down there, thanks to Joe. And you can see the village here. You can see the church in the middle of the village. And you can see that there are rows of houses around the church, some of them more intact than others, from that original placita that was built. And here's a photo of Joe himself, Joe talking to John Burns in front of the church there in El Cerrito. So he's the guy that was kind enough to let me use his house. He wasn't there at the time. And final benchmark, again for me, not for the village. Here is a cover of my book about El Cerrito. This was published, University of Oklahoma Press, 2003. And the title is El Cerrito, New Mexico, 8 Generations in a Spanish Village. Okay, so much for a walk through the history of the village. Let's go to topic number 3 here, rebuilding El Cerrito's schoolhouse. The school was closed in 1951, and this is what the building looked like 5 years later. This is 1956. Charles Loomis revisited the school in 1956, and he took this photo. And what had happened was that the Torres family simply preempted the building, and it made it into its barn, and they stored hay in their barn. So you can see that that one door right there now has kind of a hay ramp, a ramp that loaded hay into the schoolhouse. Well, one day, about 1958, two little kids, about 5 years old, boy and a girl, decided that they would cook eggs. And they started a fire, and guess what? The hay caught fire and the schoolhouse burned down. So, when I now first see the schoolhouse in 1980 and take a photo of it, there were a couple walls that were substantial, but really it was one great big hole full of a lot of charred wood. And I then attended the Vigil family reunion. This was in 2008. And my friend Edmund Gallegos looked at three of us and said, "Hey, you guys, I want to take your photo out in front." So we all went out and stood in front, and that was the photo we took. And after he took the photo, he said, "You know what I just did? I took a photo of the two people that burnt the schoolhouse down and the guy that built it back up again," which was very nice of him. Okay, now this is my good friend Brock Brown. Brock is one of my doctoral advisees. He had a career teaching geography at Texas State University in San Marcos, Texas. And I was able to buy the schoolhouse lot in 1982. And I asked Brock, would you go in on rebuilding the schoolhouse with me if we were to do that, rebuild the schoolhouse on the lot? And he said, of course, yes, because he wanted a headquarters to take students to for his field trips from Texas to Cerrito, and I wanted the same thing, a headquarters for my students from OU. Well, we built the schoolhouse, and it was a 10-year project, and the 10 years lasted from 2005 until 2014. And every year we'd go out for a week with a whole bunch of volunteer labor. This was the week around Memorial Day, and we got it done in one 10-year period. And we tried to rebuild the schoolhouse as authentically as we could, but I wouldn't have done it had Brock not told me that he'd go in on it with me. So let me take you through the steps that we went through to rebuild the schoolhouse. And here we are beginning day one with shovelful number one, where Mike Stevens, one of my students, is beginning to excavate the stem wall that was the foundation for the original schoolhouse. That was still preserved after the fire. And now we see Brock with a front loader scooping all that debris out from inside the school. We had to have that stem wall inspected to be able to build adobe walls above it. So here we're making adobe bricks. We made 4,000 adobe bricks. You had to add straw, we were told, to make that brick kind of stick together, make it coherent, cohesive, I guess I should say. So here we are building adobe bricks. Here's the form. These bricks were the same size as the original bricks in the schoolhouse. I mean, 18 inches by 8 inches by 4 inches, heavy. And in fact, there is Macario Torres. He's a villager. I hired him to work with us. He was retired from CF&I in Pueblo, Colorado, and each of those bricks weighed 30 pounds. So this took a little work. And now we go up with the walls and build the frames for the doors and the windows. And here's our batter board guy, making sure the walls are straight. And here's Brock with the carpentry work. I hired a guy named Placido Tafoya, and he was a pretty doggone good adobe mason. You can see that there is a conduit coming up through the crack in between the bricks there, and that was where the electrical wire would go down the wall. Here's Jeff Roth, another one of my students. He's slinging mud up for the laying of the adobe brick on top of the wall. After the walls were 10 feet high, the same height as the original building, we put a cement bond beam on them to stabilize the structure. And these bolts then were for the trusses to be bolted to. So then we had prefabricated trusses made in Portales. They could barely get those trusses on a truck into the village because of the hairpin turns coming down off the mesa into the valley. And once the trusses were in place, there was the decking on the roof, and then the corrugated metal sheeting over the decking. And now the floor, completing the floor, and the floor then finally gets some saltillo tile on it, as you'll see in a second. Now, what was not authentic in our rebuilding of the schoolhouse was the plumbing. We decided we needed water. The original schoolhouse did not have water. They had to bring water from the irrigation ditch up for those kids. And we also added electricity. And here we are hooking up the electricity. So here's a photo of me in the middle and Brock Brown and our contractor. We hired a guy named Robert Whitwer. Everybody liked Robert. Robert would come out at the beginning of the morning and he'd tell us amateurs what we should do. And then he'd leave for the day and he'd come back the next morning to see if we did it and did it right and show us what to do for the next step. So we really needed to have Robert, and he didn't charge us much. We really needed to have him as our contractor. This is what the schoolhouse looked like pretty near the end. We hadn't put the doors up yet, the two doors, but this is the building. And here it is when we had our open house in 2014. The school now was finished. We invited the villagers, we invited all the Cerriteños that had gone elsewhere in New Mexico and Colorado to come. There were 70 people that came on that day. It was a wonderful event, and we really were giving the schoolhouse to the village. You could see the saltillo tile on the floor in that photo and also in this one. And around the walls now we have photos, we have plaques, we have stuff that the villagers have donated to go inside their community center. I should say that El Cerrito Schoolhouse is now a community center. It became that in 2020, just last year. And here's a plaque that shows the people that worked on the schoolhouse. 45 people were volunteers. Of that number, 21 were geographers. They came from OU, they came from Texas State, they came from the University of Nebraska, from Kansas State, also from the University of Central Oklahoma. They came from various schools. My students going off and coming back with their own students is what it was. So we had 45 volunteers. We had 15 paid workers like Robert Whitwer that we had to have for electricity and things like that. So today, the El Cerrito Schoolhouse is the El Cerrito Community Center, and we're only now working on drafting bylaws for how the center will be run rather, and just what will happen with it. Okay, so let me turn then to the final point. Why is El Cerrito important? And here, let me say, make 3 points. This is a photo taken by Rusinoff from El Cerrito, from the little hill. And in this photo, you can see the school right there. In the village, and the church you can't see, but it's kind of in the middle of the village there. Point 1 about the importance of El Cerrito. It is a very well documented village. Indeed, of the some 350 total Spanish villages, it could be that El Cerrito is the best documented of all of them. And my second point is that it is a very well preserved village. Not the best in being preserved, but very well preserved. In that isolation, the 6 miles of dirt road one way and 10 miles of dirt road coming in another way has really been a factor in the preservation of the village. Now here's the school, here's the church in the middle of that open space. One row of houses along this side, this is the south side, totally intact. All the houses, those are the first houses that were around, that original placita. Quite a few of the houses intact on that side, quite a few, well, not as many that side, and even less on this side. But this is all, be on this side over here. This is all reason for saying that El Cerrito is a very well-preserved village. Dirt roads to this day, jacal fences along those dirt roads, juniper posts, stood in vertically to make a jacal fence, long lots on the floodplain, irrigation ditch, um, just the same course as the irrigation ditch was when they first dug their irrigation ditch. And here we have some OU students and other students cleaning the irrigation ditch on ditch day. So, okay, why is El Cerrito important? Point one, well documented. Point two, well preserved. And point three, it is a window on the past. It became my window on the past. Here I was teaching historical geography. And you can't go back in time. But what you can do, the next best thing to going back in time, is to find a place that is well preserved and use your imagination as to what it was like in the past. So that's what I was trying to do when I took groups of students out there talking about the history of this village. So on my field trips like this one, this was 1984, this was my attempt to talk about historical geography through the example of El Cerrito. And in this photo, here is Susan, my wife. My wife chokes me up in 1984. So my last photo is Ansel Adams' Moonlight over Hernandez, one of these 350 or so villages made famous by Ansel Adams taking this photo in 1939. And I am sorry that I can't answer questions because this is a recording, but if you would like to email me, here's my email address, rnostrandok, Oklahoma, @gmail.com, and I'd be happy to respond to questions that you might have. So, thank you very much.